Okay, let's open in a word of prayer. Father, thanks so much for your word that you give us that we can understand and know the times that we live in. Pray that you will bless our time together today. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, today we're going to talk a little bit about decisions, because there's a lot of decisions that are being made in a lot of different areas. I'll talk about the two Supreme Court decisions and give you my take on that, because I do think they were both very significant. And then we'll talk about some of the other decisions that are being made in the Middle East, particularly in Turkey, Libya, Syria, and Israel. So I think all of those are important. And we talk each week about the convergence of events. And each week it seems like there are a lot of things that are happening that are certainly foreshadows of things that were to come in Bible prophecy. It is can be a very distressing, as we noted last week, a very disrupted world, and very distressing. And I'll reiterate the verse that I quoted out of Joshua last week. Have I not commanded thee? Be strong and of a good courage. Be not afraid, neither be thou dismayed, for the Lord thy God is with thee whithersoever thou goest. And we have a lot of things going on. So let's just look at some of the news event things. I don't really even have that much on the coronavirus this week, if you can believe it. It's almost like everybody's forgotten about that. And but one of the things that has been concern is that the contact tracing that's going on. You know, there's the Trace Act that's been proposed in Congress. I think it's still stuck in committee. I don't know that it'll ever pass. But there has been a lot of effort by the big tech companies and local governments to trace people that have been sick with the virus, and then to trace all the contacts that they have. And maybe some suggestions are that even some of those people would be put into a forced quarantine. What's interesting is in a lot of cases, the big tech component of that, and if you've updated your iPhone recently, there is a thing there under privacy and health that says COVID tracking or something like that. It's turned off by default, but it will be activated if you download a state government app to it'll do contact tracing and that type of thing. It'll give your location out. It's all supposed to be anonymous, but the experience was in Asia when some of these things weren't in place, particularly in South Korea. It was very easy for people to figure out who it was that was supposedly sick and had the virus, and that led to some problems. Everybody keeps saying, "Oh, well, don't worry about, there'll be privacy." The fact that, or the claim that there is privacy or concern about privacy is a bit of an illusion in our culture today, because, as we've noted many times, they're tracing you everywhere. But it's very interesting that one of the things that's happening is that as they've started to go out and try to do this manually, they're finding that they're not doing a very good job of I wonder what that, I thought it was maybe something out of my computer. They're not doing a very good job of being able to connect people. And the big tech companies have dropped out. In Israel, where they were using Shin Bet apps or technology to trace people, even there the government has decided that they had such a concern with privacy that they're backing off of that. So that's, I guess, a little bit of good news. The other thing that's related, I don't have a graphic for it. I did see an article this morning in the New York Times that they are actually trying to starting a lot of different virus or vaccine trials. There are, from what I've read, hundreds of these proposed vaccines. One of these is a DNA-based vaccine that has a lot of people concerned. I don't know if they're going to be able to develop it, because they've never been able to do this before. with regard to humans, and I think they're just going to have a lot of public opposition to this. But we'll just have to see. They are doing trials. They had in the New York Times article this morning, they had a picture of a lady. I think one of them is a teacher, the other is a nurse, and they both are participating in some of the early vaccine trials. And nobody knows how this is going to go yet. As I said, there are a lot of ethical concerns and that type of thing with the vaccines. I just don't know how successful they will be, especially if, as it appears that the coronavirus thing is not as serious as they thought early on. There's still been a lot of people get sick, a lot of people die, but it's limited in some communities and certain places. So I just don't know that the push for the vaccines is necessarily going to be successful in this environment. And nobody's really talking about it publicly now anyway, because everybody else is concerned with about 20 other things. So that's my thought on that. I thought I had. Here's something coronavirus related. There are reports that parts of Beijing, even large portions of Beijing, have been shut down because of an outbreak of coronavirus. Don't know how serious that is. There are concerns about that. The report was on Monday, authorities locked down 10 residential neighborhoods near a market in the northern district of Haidian after a asymptomatic case was found there, almost doubling the number of citizens prohibited from stepping outside their apartments to 90,000 from about 40,000, according to official data. And China is using some pretty onerous rules to impose their views on things. And this is also a report, Wall Street Journal, tech spies pivot to the pandemic. Because of the concerns that people have over their privacy and their tracking abilities in these apps, they're now saying, oh, well, we're just against the coronavirus. They're sort of marketing themselves. And we'll see how this goes. I don't know that at this point that there's going to be much tolerance for these things. So there were two Supreme Court decisions this week. The first one was a decision regarding the 1964 Civil Rights Act. In 1964, Congress enacted a Civil Rights Act that prohibited discrimination based on race, religion, and sex. There have been and it was pretty clear when that was enacted that everybody understood that sex in that case meant gender, male or female. And you were not allowed to, and it was mainly because there was a lot of concern that people were being discriminated against because they were a woman. They weren't getting hired. And so there's been a lot of push for affirmative action among women, among minorities over the years. It's to the point now where I believe, like, for example, in the law, the law school classes that people enter these days, the class that's there for 3 years before they graduate, there are actually more women in almost every class in every law school than there are men. But there was a concern in 1964 about sex discrimination. There was also the concern about race discrimination, and there's been massive amounts of litigation over the years, as you are all aware, about what constitutes race discrimination or sex discrimination. But in the case of sex discrimination, everybody pretty much understood that it was related to gender. You're discriminated against because you're a woman. There were many efforts made to modify the statute to include other things that people wanted. For example, they don't want people discriminating against you based on sexual orientation or your decision to be transgender or not, to change your gender. All of those efforts to amend the statute to broaden the definitions or include things in the statute failed. Every single one failed. As a result, it was pretty clear to everyone for decades. So we're talking a 1964 act. And you're getting up into the 2000s, 2010, into the Obama administration, and the act has not been changed. And people that felt that they were discriminated against on the basis of their sexual orientation could not bring federal civil rights cases. Now, there were a lot of state cases and local ordinances and state laws that were enacted to prohibit this, but at the federal level, it had never been done. During the course of the Obama administration came up with this clever idea, and they're leftist, Marxist types, and language doesn't mean anything to them. They're postmoderns. So they figured they could just redefine sex to include sexual orientation and transgender, LGBTQ issues. And so they put these rules in place, and when the Trump administration came in, Trump wanted to roll that back. So there has now been some litigation. So here's the situation. We have a law where the definition is very clear. We have attempts to amend the law, which have all failed. We have a rogue administration that decides, the Obama administration decides, well, we don't care. We're not the legislature, we're the executive branch, but we're just going to redefine it anyway. And then you have the Trump administration coming in and say, no, we're going to roll that back. Whatever the Obama administration did, we're not going to accept that. But there has been a push in the courts by left-leaning lawyers, the ACLU, and others to get the courts to redefine the statute. Finally, several of those cases made their way all the way to the Supreme Court. And this week, in a 6-3 decision, the Supreme Court, in a majority opinion written by the newest justice, well, that's, I guess, the second newest justice of the Supreme Court, Neil Gorsuch, said, yeah, we agree, essentially, we agree with what the Obama administration tried to do. We don't really care that they tried to amend this act for, 1964, for 56 years. They've not been able to amend this act, but sex really means this. And Gorsuch issued, in my view, a very weak opinion. It was clear that the decision, they wanted to get to a decision, and they made up all the rest. And they sort of shoved aside things like interpreting words like they mean, and they just shoved all that aside because they wanted to get to a particular decision. So the main case, the Bostock versus Clayton County, Georgia case, and so it was a 6-3 decision. Gorsuch wrote the majority opinion, and then the dissent, the lead dissent, was issued by Justice Alito. And here's a little graphic that shows how they voted. For example, this is from the New York Times. So they say it's a 6-3 vote, and they say there are 4 justices in the liberal bloc and 5 justices in the conservative bloc, which I would not do based on the decision today. I would not put John Roberts in the conservative bloc. I don't care what people like, commentators like Hugh Hewitt say. To think that John Roberts is a traditional originalist, conservative, and interpreting Supreme Court decisions is a fantasy. He has not shown to be a reliable justice from a conservative judicial standpoint. So here, for example, the New York Times also has this survey. It should be illegal for employees to be fired based on sexual orientation. 83% of people agree with that. Democrats, it's 90%, independents, 84%, and Republicans, 74%. But this survey, in my view, is totally irrelevant because the statute doesn't say that. So we can argue about whether people should or should not be fired based on sexual orientation and that sort of thing. But if Congress wants to put that in law, it's very simple to do. Pass a law. Although, when you look at the state of Congress today, it doesn't seem that it's very simple for Congress to do anything of substance. What do these people do anyway? Does anybody know? I mean, I don't know that they do anything significant except take up space and get big salaries and pensions. And I'm always amazed at somebody I was a poor school teacher and I went to Congress and now they're multimillionaires. I just don't understand how that happened when their salary is $150,000 a year, but that's, or $200,000 or whatever it is now. So what I like to do when I see a decision that I don't like is I like to read the dissent. In particular, I like to read, whether it's a majority opinion or dissent, I like to read Justice Alito's opinions. And when Justice Scalia was alive, I like to read what he wrote, because I think they were both conservative justices that looked at what the words actually said. So they were originalists with regard to the Constitution, and they would be conservative in the way that they interpreted a particular statute. So this case was not really a constitutional case, it was a statutory case, statutory interpretation. So here are some things that Alito said, and I think I pretty much agree with everything Alito said in his dissent. And I'm going to refer a lot to it because I think it's a very important dissent. This is a very big deal case. And I'll explain why a little bit when we get down to some of the details of Alito's dissent. But here are some quotes from the case. What the court has done today, interpreting discrimination because of sex to encompass discrimination because of sexual orientation or gender identity, is virtually certain to have far-reaching consequences. He notes in his dissent that there are over 100 federal statutes that prohibit discrimination because of sex. And what he did, if you download the opinion, it's pretty long, it's close to 200 pages, but a lot of the opinion is this appendix that list all of these federal statutes that have prohibitions against discrimination based on sex. Now, some people are upset that Alito did that. And they're like, oh, why did you tell them all the statutes they need to go change and litigate under and cause even more problems? But the fact of the matter is they all know what the statutes are. It's very easy with computerized legal research to find these things in about, maybe it'll take you longer to log on your computer if you have a complex password than it will to, get on the Westlaw or LexisNexis or other legal research sites and find out all of these laws. Very easy to do. But the point of the fact is that there are a lot of statutes, and this will change. This is not limited to the Civil Rights Statute. This opinion will be used for everything else. He notes this: the brief in the three cases that were argued together for Monday's landmark ruling have called to our attention the potential effects that the court's reasoning may have under some of these laws, but the court waves those considerations aside. The court attempts to pass off its decision as the inevitable product of the textualist school of statutory interpretation, championed by our late colleague Justice Scalia, but no one should be fooled. He said this: the court's opinion is like a pirate ship. It sails under a textualist flag, but what it actually represents is a theory of statutory interpretation that Justice Scalia excoriated, the theory that courts should update old statutes so that they better reflect the current values of society. And this is what the Obama administration tried to do, and now they are aided and abetted by 6 justices on the Supreme Court, including 2 who claim to be conservative in the way they interpret things. Somebody wrote to me, how do we change this? How do we change this? How do we overturn the Supreme Court decision? Can we impeach Roberts and Alito? Listen, I think in the history of the United States, there have been 3 judges that have been impeached. The last one was Alcee Hastings from Florida. He was impeached because of concerns about corruption. And what happened to him? He became a congressman. Okay, so I don't know if he gets to stack his judicial pension and his congressional pension. I don't know if they took that away from him. I wouldn't be too concerned. But so these impeaching a justice is virtually impossible. You would have to have a trial. like they were going to do with President Trump or did with President Trump, and then you would have to get a 2/3 vote of the Senate. Do you think you would get the 2/3 vote of the Senate on anything? I mean, if they voted at noon that it was noon, I don't think they would get 2/3 in favor of, or a 2/3 agreement among that crowd. That's not very optimistic. So here's some more of what Alito said. In all those dictionaries, the primary definition of sex was essentially the same as that in the then most most recent edition of Webster's New International Dictionary. One of the two divisions of organisms formed on the distinction of male and female. And he goes through to cite this. The court does not dispute that this is what sex means in Title VII, although it clearly suggests that there is at least some support for a different and potentially relevant definition. But the court declines to stand on that ground, and instead proceeds to the assumption that sex refers only to biological distinctions between male and female. If that is so, it should be perfectly clear that Title VII does not reach discrimination because of sexual orientation or gender identity. If sex in Title VII means biologically male or female, then discrimination because of sex means discrimination because the person in question is biologically male or biologically female, not because that person is sexually attracted to members of the same sex or identifies as a member of a particular gender. This is very concerning. Now, I have mentioned a number of times, back in the early 2000s, I became very concerned about a thing called postmodernism. If you go down here to Ohio State University, you have, some people would say it's postmodern. You have that monstrosity thing called the Wexner Center. Have you seen this thing? Nothing that, stairways go to nowhere, things don't match up, it's all discombobulated and that sort of thing. And that's a postmodern building. And it's the same way when you use postmodernism in language, it becomes discombobulated and it doesn't work. It's weird. It just jars you. But the problem that I noted and others had noted was this postmodern thought was coming into the church. It eventually led to things like the emergent church and the emerging church and that sort of thing. But I remember I spoke about this at a conference in California in August 2001, a couple months before 9/11, and I said, this is not going to be a good thing if this redefinition, making language mean what you think, what you want it to mean, or what your feelings tell you it should mean, will be a bad thing. And I will tell you, it was a conference of mostly pastors and church leaders that I spoke at, and I had some pastors come up to me and say, John, you don't understand, postmodernism will be a good thing for the church. I'm not kidding you. So here we are 20 years later almost, and I would say that who was right in that particular situation? In fact, it didn't take but a year or two before this nonsense in the emergent church, Brian McLaren and Doug Padgett and Rob Bell and all these other people, all this nonsense started coming into the evangelical church. Now people have said, well, postmodernism went away. The emergent church went away. No, it didn't. It just was brought into a large portion of the evangelical church, so to the point where they sort of mainstreamed themselves, in my view. And that's why we have these great divisions, and that's why when you see these things going on with Black Lives Matter and all this thing, and these pastors and these statements that are issued and taking a knee and adopting social justice and neo-Marxist language, it's all connected. This all started decades ago, and now this is the fruit of it. So Alito notes that sex means gender in these particular cases. He says this, take comfort that there are exemptions, but what do these exemptions mean now? Again, Alito, the logic of the court's decision could even affect professional sports. under the court's holding that Title VII prohibits employment discrimination because of transgender status, an athlete who has the physique of a man but identifies as a woman could claim the right to play on a women's professional sports team. The owners of that team might try to claim that biological sex is a bona fide occupational qualification. But the court's decision may lead to Title IX cases against any college that resists assigning students of the opposite biological sex as roommates. A provision of Title IX allows schools to maintain separate living facilities for the different sexes, but it may be argued that a student's sex is the gender with which the student identifies. Similar claims may be brought under the Fair Housing Act. Maybe I should have titled this Decisions. I should have titled today Can of Worms, because this is exactly what the court has done doing this. Now, the biggest concern is employment by religious organizations. And I have seen some Christian attorneys say, don't worry about it. It's not a big deal, John, or anybody who's concerned about this. You're just running around making too much of this. It's not that big a deal because there are exemptions that are to protect, like churches that employ ministers and churches that have schools that employ teachers. There's a ministerial exception. Now, my point is this. If they've changed the basic definition of sex, do you think that they might change and play around with these exceptions, like the ministerial exception? And the answer is, you can take that one to the bank. That one is a sure thing that they're going to do. And so people who are running around, I'm thinking of a female attorney that I saw say, oh, no, don't worry, there are exceptions. I say baloney. We had the definition of sex and they changed that. Don't you think they're going to mess around with the exceptions? And Congress doesn't have to do anything. And what happens if there's a different administration come January 20th, 2021? What do you think they're going to do? I can show you the video of Joe Biden here in Columbus last year on the Human Rights Campaign saying, the first thing I'm going to do is put in the Equality Act. And I would think that even, now he may not remember that he actually said that at this point, but somebody else will, and somebody else that's running the show will, if he is president. I almost feel like making the sign of the cross there. He'll change it. He'll put in the Equality Act provisions, even though Congress hasn't enacted the Equality Act. But what happens if it's Democratic House, Democratic Senate, Democratic President? Do you think there's any protection against it? Oh, we could appeal it to the Supreme Court. Well, that's very comforting now, right? The Supreme Court of what country? Not the Supreme Court of the United States under Chief Justice John Roberts and the faux conservative Neil Gorsuch. So employment by religious organizations, here's what Alito says. Regardless of some people who are saying, oh, it's not that big a deal, here's what he says. Briefs filed by a wide range of religious groups, Christian, Jewish, and Muslim, express deep concern that the position now adopted by the court will trigger open conflict with faith-based employment practices of numerous churches, synagogues, and other religious institutions. They argue that religious organizations need employees who actually live the faith, and that compelling a religious organization to employ individuals whose conduct flouts the tenets of the organization's faith forces the group to communicate an objectionable message. And he's right. This is going to be a problem. The problem is perhaps most acute, Alito says, when it comes to the employment of teachers. A school's standards for its faculty communicate a particular way of life to its students. And a violation by the faculty of those precepts may undermine the school's moral teaching. And there would be an exception here for Macron, who married his high school teacher in France, but nevertheless, most people would try to avoid those type of relations. Thus, if a religious school teaches that sex outside marriage and sex reassignment procedures are immoral, the message may be lost if the school employs a teacher who has a same-sex relationship or has undergone or is undergoing sex reassignment. Yet today's decision may lead to Title VII claims by such teachers and applicants for employment. At least some teachers and applicants for teaching positions may be blocked from recovering on such claims by the ministerial exception recognized in Hosanna Tabor Evangelical Lutheran Church and School versus the EEOC from 2012. But he says, I don't know that based on today's decision that we could see that the court would actually interpret ministerial exception correctly or the way that Congress wrote it. He also says transgender employees have brought suit under Title VII to challenge employer-provided health insurance plans that do not cover costly sex reassignment surgery. Similar claims have been brought under the Affordable Care Act, which broadly prohibits sex discrimination in the provision of health care. And his point is, all of this stuff is on the table now. He also goes on, he cites a number of other categories. He says that such claims present difficult religious liberty issues because some employers and healthcare providers have strong religious objections to sex reassignment procedures and therefore requiring them to pay or perform for these procedures will have a severe impact on their ability to honor their deeply held religious beliefs. He also says that it might affect freedom of speech. The court's decision may even affect the way employers address their employees and the way teachers and school officials address students. Under established English usage, two sets of sex-specific singular personal pronouns are used to refer to someone in the third person, he, him, and his for males, she, her, and hers for females. But several different sets of gender-neutral pronouns have now been created and are preferred by some individuals who do not identify as falling into either of these two traditional categories. Some jurisdictions, such as New York City, have ordinance making the failure to use an individual's preferred pronoun a punishable offense, and some colleges have similar rules. This is, it's sort of like, how would you describe things that go with the apocalypse? Now throw in the stuff about this Black Lives Matters and Antifa and social justice and terminology and all the things that are happening, and layer that into this situation, and what do you have? Listen, as I've said, I'm nearing my end of my career as a lawyer. It should be obvious. I'm an old man by some terms. I'm fine with that, okay? But I have to tell you, I put these things up each week, and I talk about these things from a biblical point of view. And I don't know. I have talked to other lawyers who are concerned that have similar beliefs that I do, that they're not going to be able to, they'll be fired by their law firm. They'll be terminated. And it's happening everywhere. I mean, you see a professor at UCLA who's terminated because he won't give lenient grading on an exam to students who are upset by what happened to George Floyd. There are a lot of things in this world that upset me, okay? I never asked for lenient grading that I know of. I prayed for it, okay? But this is a problem. And so you throw all of this stuff, you add all this other burdens about what you can and can't say, and it's pretty clear we have a major, major problem. And the problem, if not dealt with correctly and aggressively, there's no doubt that it will lead to Christian persecution. The Wall Street Journal, in their editorial after the decision in the civil rights case on the definition of sex, called this another win for the Kagan court. She's, Elena Kagan is a very, very liberal Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. She was a dean at Harvard. And so here's what the editorial says. Congratulations to Chief Justice Elena Kagan on her big win Monday at the Supreme Court on gay and transgender rights. But she might as, okay, she isn't the chief, but she might as well be, as her redefining of Anton Scalia's jurisprudence prevailed in a startling 6-3 ruling that included Chief Justice John Roberts and Justice Neil Gorsuch. Justice Kagan didn't write the majority opinion, but her views are all over Justice Gorsuch's opinion that essentially rewrites Title VII of the 1964 Act. While Justice Gorsuch, the Wall Street Journal editorial concedes that the homosexuality and transgender status are distinct concepts from sex, he says that discrimination based on homosexuality or transgender status necessarily entails discrimination based on sex. The first cannot happen without the second. And that sort of encapsulates what Gorsuch says. It's a direct quote of what he says, and it's absolute, complete nonsense. And how many people fought to get this guy in the court? Daniel Greenfield writing at Front Page Magazine, Supreme Court redefines sex, threatens freedom of religion, is a good article to read. He says this, words can mean anything and nobody cares about facts anyway anymore. That's probably true. Now, there was also a decision on the DACA, something about the Dreamers Act or helping children that have been brought here by other illegal aliens against their will, and how do we deal with them, and should we be gracious to them and help them through, and that type of thing. And you know what's happened is that that has been abused by people. And during the Obama administration, it was used to bring in anybody and everybody, and upset the immigration system because they're looking for more voters. I think that's pretty clear. And by the way, they're going to do this stuff called ballot harvesting in a lot of places in the fall, where people are going to go to your house and pick up your ballot. Where's the security? And how do we know that somebody's not going to be coming to you saying, you better put the right X's on there? Because people be coming by later to talk to you. Or you better never leave the house. You know this will happen. The whole country will become Chicago. That's my fear. So the DACA decision, and what happened in the DACA decision was the Obama administration had put in place rules, legislation. They had legislated rules for how this was going to be dealt with that clearly, it's very questionable as to whether they had the authority to do that under any authorizing legislation. The legislature can give the executive branch authority to enact rules, but Obama just went ahead and did it anyway. Trump came in and rolled those back, and then that was appealed, and the Supreme Court decision in a 5-4 decision, the opinion written by Chief Justice Roberts, struck down what Trump did. Now, I saw the president say the other night that, well, you know, we can redo it, we just have to do it a different way. I'm sorry, Mr. President, I disagree with you on this. No matter what you do, the same court that redefines sex will change the rules on you. You cannot count on them to do anything. Now, I do want to say this. So I think the DACA decision and the sex definition of sex under the Civil Rights Act, I think they're very closely related, because you had the Obama administration legislating things, and the DACA thing was an executive order. So why can't the next executive come in and rescind the order? That seems to make perfect sense to me, right? Not with the great Obama. Must kneel to the wisdom of the great Obama at all cost. Now, I will say there was one thing this week that's actually good news. I had talked about this last year, that in Europe, what they're trying to do with social media and everything is they're trying to shut down conservative voices. And the big tech companies are pretty effective at it. The big tech companies say, well, it's our platform, we can decide. Well, but the Trump administration and others have done, no, wait a minute. You get an exemption from being sued for what people put on your platform, but which nobody else gets. And so they're trying to take that away. And they're doing things like Twitter banned Katie Hopkins just yesterday. Permanently banned her. She's been banned off and on in the past. And she's now permanently banned, and Twitter essentially said, don't bother even trying to come back. You're gone. 1 million followers on Twitter. And you may not agree with all of her views of the way that she says things, but you have these Antifa activists posting things that are kill the cops and that type of thing, and they're okay. Katie Hopkins says, look at this thing. It's what's going on in the world. It's insane. And she's banned. So what they did in Europe, France and Germany have enacted essentially hate crime legislation that requires if there's questionable content, objectionable content on their platform, they can be told by a government employee, you got 24 hours to take that down, or you're going to be facing fines of like $50,000 a day or an hour. Now, part of what they did was they went to these countries in Europe that are don't have any compunction against controlling your thought, like France and Germany. And we've had problems with France and Germany in the past, if you may know from studying history. So France and Germany have put in place this legislation. A very left-wing member of parliament in France put in this stuff, and it was appealed, and then the French court came out, praise the Lord, and said, this law is unconstitutional in France. The Macron administration supported it wholeheartedly. My concern with it was that Google, Facebook, Twitter, all the big tech social media platforms were going to adopt the restrictive European rules and apply them to the United States, where we have a different constitution and different freedoms. Because the most restrictive is they're just not going to bother saying, well, that's the U.S. and this is Europe and we live in an international community. We'll just choose the most restrictive one. And we'll choose Europe because we appreciate Europe stepping up to the plate, because otherwise it would look like we were supporting China and their restrictions. So this is the flagship provision in France's new law, which was supported by Emmanuel Macron's government and sponsored by his party, created an obligation for online platforms to take down hateful content flagged by users within 24 hours. If the platforms failed to do so, they risk fines of up to 1.25 million euros, or about 1.4 million. We'll multiply that by thousands and thousands and thousands of these things. And the left is going to do things like this. Now, I've been seeing reports that, President Trump had a rally in Tulsa last night, and it wasn't a full arena. But now it appears that there are reports that people on the left were flooding the ticket requests and getting ticket requests, knowing that they would never show up. This is how they were very clever at using social media. So this is what's happening. So this is good news, though, that this law in France has been struck down. It's being challenged in Germany. Other countries are also grappling with how to regulate online content, the article says. In Britain, policymakers are drafting a new online harms bill that would restrict certain violent and extremist content from being shared, like Katie Hopkins or J.K. Rowling saying this transgenderism stuff is hurting women. I mean, she's very supportive of women's rights, but so she says the transgender thing is hurting women. And at some point, are they even going to have women's sports in college? Why worry about all this nonsense and get rid of it and just I have a football team, I have a basketball team. If you're good enough, you get to play on the sports team. And it's all done merit-based. We don't care, race, sex, color, whatever. If you're good, you're on the team. Oh, and if you're a biological male who's running over biological females, you're going to get whooped when you try out for the man's football team or basketball team or track team, because you're a bad male athlete pretending to be a female athlete so you can get an award. And I think the whole thing is just it's indicative of, I think, a reprobate minds that are operating at every level. So that is that's it. So let's look at some of the other news things that are going on. This one's out of order, but I'll just cover it now. Egypt and Ethiopia are on the verge of war. Egypt sent tanks last week into Libya. And so the reports I'm reading today is that that Egypt and Turkey are on the verge of war. Now, Egypt is on the verge of war with Ethiopia. Why? Because Ethiopia is damming up the Blue Nile. There are two branches that form the Nile River, the White Nile and the Blue Nile. The Blue Nile originates out of Ethiopia, flows through Sudan, joins up with the White Nile, and it forms the mighty river that flows through Egypt. And 97 or 98% of the people in Egypt live very close to the Nile River. It's vital to their lifeblood. And we're talking about a country of 90 million people. And there's also some prophecies in Ezekiel and Isaiah a little bit about the Nile that I don't have time to go into right now. You might look those up, because I think this is a Bible prophecy thing. So Ethiopia is filling up the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. The acronym is GERD. And as I noted to somebody this week, it appears that the Ethiopian GERD is giving heartburn to Egypt. And so they're filling it up. It'll take 5 to 15 years to fill this up. But as they fill this up, if they fill it up in a very short period of time, for every percent that they go up, it takes away 200,000 acres of Egyptian farmland. This is a big problem. Hungry people get angry. So this is leading to war. And so they've been having negotiations. They've been going back and forth. They have mediators, meetings, all this stuff. And this week, the negotiations are not going anywhere. And Ethiopia said, we're starting. We're starting to fill it up. We'll try to work this. And so these water things are becoming a big deal. I mentioned last week that China is taking over the rivers coming out of that's why they want Tibet so badly, because they control the rivers coming out of the Himalayas, and they can shut off the water to Pakistan or Bangladesh, India, Thailand, Cambodia, Myanmar. They control it all now. And big problems in Vietnam and Cambodia with the Mekong River being, even though they had pretty good rains last year, China had a drought, so they took a lot of the water. The Chinese government sometimes reminds me of that, the aliens that showed up in that movie Independence Day that were sort of like locusts, just kind of going around the universe and consuming all the resources. That is what China is like. So here's some stuff. This is a little bit about the Black Lives Matter thing. This is Portland, Oregon. This is a statue of George Washington. On the left, it's been wrapped in a flag that they lit. You see down there, genocidal colonialist. And look at this. Don't shoot, BLM, land back, white fragility. And this is, here's some more pictures of what they did. I tried to blot out some of the F cops thing. You probably know what it means You've seen it painted all over the place now. But the interesting thing is, by the way, in the bottom right-hand corner, that's Thomas Jefferson at Jefferson High School in Portland. That's his statue that's been torn down. They tore down the statue of Ulysses Grant someplace. He led the Northern Army that fought in the Civil War, right? To end slavery? Well, maybe not to them. And then here you see 1619. This is a direct reference to that abysmal 1619 project that Hannah Jones, whatever her name is, put in place that talked about everything that America ever stood for was racism and to support slavery. Even though a lot of what she said has been debunked and shown to be patently false, they were putting that in curriculum all over the country, colleges, universities, and secondary schools. Do you think they won? And so all these things have been going on in the background for decades while we've been asleep, I guess. And so the education system is, I was listening to Dennis Prager the other day, and a guy called in. Well, I'll talk about that in just a moment. But here's a statute that's lasted in Seattle. This is a current photo a couple days ago of a statue of Lenin. He's okay. Killed millions, but he's okay because he was a Marxist, communist, and we like him. And you see the narrative is changing. This has been posted on some of the social media accounts of the BLM and Antifa supporters. The New York Post suggested that the riots now could be call them the 1619 riots, to which Hannah Jones, the author of the 1619 Project, said, "It would be an honor if you did that. Thank you." It's sick. It's evil and it's sick. Here's an editorial from Friday, Why Juneteenth Matters, in the New York Times. It says here, the big thing says, Black Americans fulfilled Lincoln's promise of a new birth of freedom. Now, this is an editorial that passed the editorial standards of the New York Times. Here's what it says. This is a direct quote from the editorial. Neither Abraham Lincoln nor the Republican Party freed the slaves. They helped set freedom in motion and eventually codified it into law with the 13th Amendment, but they were not themselves responsible for the end of slavery. Oh, what was? They were not the ones who brought about its final destruction. Who freed the slaves? The slaves freed the slaves. So, a lot of them helped. We're grateful that they helped end that evil institution. But do you see what's happening here? The narrative is, Lincoln, he was a white guy. He couldn't have had anything to do with this. Ulysses Grant actually, at one point, somebody gave him a slave and he freed the guy. Look at what they're doing here. This is a picture of outside the Speaker of the House office, Speakers of the House office, Nancy Pelosi's office in Washington, D.C., removing portraits. Outside her office are portraits of everybody who's been a Speaker of the House, and 4 of them had been members of the Confederacy, so they're taking down their pictures and removing them. It brings to mind the old saying about the Soviet Union. It used to say, if you think the future is not certain in the Soviet Union, what's really uncertain is the past, because it keeps changing all the time. And this is exactly what we're going through. This is what Marxists and leftists do, is they change history. Here's from Oxford in England. They are going to decolonize their degrees. Oxford University has revealed plans to decolonize its math and science degrees and allow students of any subject who have been affected by the Black Lives Matter furor to seek lenient marking. You've heard of Rhodes Scholars? Okay, I don't know if Cecil Rhodes was a good guy or not. He's probably like most, I probably would stipulate that most people are pretty flawed, right? And sometimes we erect statues to them to honor the good things that they did, without saying that that's an endorsement of all the bad stuff that they did. But they're taking down Rhodes. You've heard of Rhodes Scholars, Oxford University. They're tearing down his statue at Oxford over one of the halls. But we live in Columbus, Ohio. At least it's called Columbus, Ohio for now. Yeah. Mayor Ginther this guy has demonstrated that he's incompetent. He's telling police to stand down when these protests are happening downtown. Now he says that City Hall's Columbus statue must go. Having this monument to this man is troubling to many, especially indigenous people. It's a great first step. The protests have just started, so many great things happening here in Columbus. I would suggest we call it Whoville, maybe would be a name for it. Somebody suggested Cowtown, but I don't know. This is Broad and High Friday afternoon. That's a picture tweeted by Larry Householder, who's the Speaker of the Ohio House. Not a cop in sight. Told to stand down by Mayor Ginther. He was busy trying to make up a nonsensical, trying to make a speech that wouldn't make him look like a complete moron. He failed at that, by the way, in my opinion. And since I work at downtown Columbus, this is like taken from like almost right in front of my building, Broad and High, and my building would be behind us. I have to pay 2% or 2.5% taxes to Columbus on my income. I'm not happy about that. I also, by the way, just sidebar, I also have to pay taxes to Charlotte, to the state of North Carolina, because my law firm has an office in North Carolina. And so they say a certain percentage of your profits come from North Carolina, so I have to, I know they do this to professional athletes, but they, filling out tax returns these days if you work for a company located, and it's going to happen to every one of us eventually. Here's a statement my wife sent me that some of the demands of these people, the resignation of Mayor Ginther, and I'd be on board with that one, but not for the reasons that they say. Resignation of the Columbus Police Department chief, free them all. We demand all incarcerated people, number 3, be freed, as well as an end to the building of new cages like jails, prisons, youth detention centers, immigration detention centers, etc. Shut down the facilities and adhere to a moratorium on new facilities. This is a dangerous and deadly environment, and especially when they are forced to pay for their own soap and sanitizer. Free assembly for political expression in Columbus. I didn't realize that they weren't having that. Free press. Cops out of public institutions and social services. Defund the police. End felony murder rule. Do you know what the felony murder rule is? That means if you're participating in a felony like robbing a bank and somebody gets killed, even if you're sitting in the car, you get charged with murder. It's a long-standing English common law doctrine. You understand what they're doing is they're tearing down everything. They're trying to destroy every foundation to cause chaos. End qualified immunity, change the name of Columbus, and remove all racist monuments. So we demand both the city's name and the holiday of Columbus Day be renamed so as not to uplift a genocidal rapist. Immediate distribution of reparations. How do you think the UN feels about that? Here's a UN Geneva tweet. UN human rights expressed profound concern over a recent statement by the U.S. Attorney General describing Antifa and other anti-fascist activists as domestic terrorists, saying it undermines the rights to freedom of expression and of peaceful assembly in the country. I don't think I put it in the area called CHAZ, the Capitol Hill area zone or whatever they called it, and they now call it CHOP in Seattle. Somebody was shot and killed last night. And I'm hearing stories of how bad it is. So I don't know. If it's that bad, just shut off the water and gas and electric and wait them out. But there are people that live there that don't want to be part of this. So where's all this going? This is kind of this is an article in the Wall Street Journal the other day, looking forward to the end of humanity. Look at what it says. The pandemic has spotlighted the promise and peril of transhumanism, the idea of using technology to overcome sickness, aging, and death. It sounds bitterly ironic now in the midst of a global pandemic, but not long ago, some of the most forward-looking people in the world believed that humanity was close to abolishing death. In 2015, the founder of Google Ventures said, "If you ask me today, is it possible to live to be 500? The answer is yes." 3 years later, biomedical researcher Aubrey de Grey estimated that people in middle age now have a fair chance of never dying. What's interesting about all of this from a Christian perspective, and I'm concerned about artificial intelligence and that type of thing, because it's artificial intelligence and not artificial wisdom. It's really stupid in many respects. It's evil in many respects. I'm very concerned with where it's going. I don't know how successful they'll be, but certainly we know that things are moving along that track. It says here, COVID-19 may turn out to be just the kind of crisis needed to turbocharge efforts to create what advocates call a transhuman future. And it's based on the Transhumanist Declaration from 1998, which says this. Number one, humanity stands to be profoundly affected by science. This is from 1998. Humanity stands to be profoundly affected by science and technology in the future. We envision the possibility of broadening human potential by overcoming aging, cognitive shortcomings, involuntary suffering, and our confinement to planet Earth. Wow. What's so interesting is that they take everything that Christianity stands for. Christianity stands for eternal life and redemption and restoration and all of these things. And we know how this all works out. And the devil is a counterfeiter. And so he's trying to counterfeit it through these different movements. The utopian ideas of Antifa and Black Lives Matter and social justice warriors and Marxists, and the technology wizards that think they're going to create this perfect world where people will never die. And if your body wears out, you just upload your brain and feelings and everything to a computer, to the cloud someplace, and you can continue to participate well into the future. Okay. So this is... It says here, as our physical worlds shrink, in an effort to avoid contracting COVID-19, our virtual worlds are expanding to make up for it. For this foreseeable future, many of us will be attending virtual schools, worshiping at virtual churches, and socializing at virtual parties. And the history of the internet suggests that once things move online, they seldom move back. Just ask department stores and CD manufacturers. Although I did see a show where they did the show was like a Zoom. It was a criminal justice show with judges, and they had a trial online. I'm a trial lawyer. This was the most boring thing I've ever seen in my life. I would, it was horrible. it's crazy. They still had real commercials, but they had the whole thing was Zoom, like all the different people, and they're talking over each other, and then somebody's dog barks in the background, and it's or heaven forbid somebody flushes a toilet. Yeah, use the mute button. This is concerning. The two largest countries in the world are battling it out. They had some mediation. There's a dispute. The word I have this morning is that there are many tanks moving to the border in the Himalayas where there's this dispute between China and India. They had a meeting the other day between the people there, the soldiers from the two countries, and they agreed not to use weapons, and they promptly started beating each other to death with clubs and throwing the others off cliffs. And I think there were 50 or 60 that were killed. And these are two nuclear powers, the two most populous nations on the planet, fighting it out. China is putting in a new national security law that would tighten their grip on Hong Kong. So we have about 10 or 12 minutes more. I'm going to talk about Turkey and Israel, Middle East mainly. This is the Hagia Sophia. It's an enormous church built during the Byzantine Empire days in the 500s. It's massive. It's just enormous. Considered by some to be one of the most complex, incredible. I mean, they built this thing 1,500 years ago, and it's amazing what they could do. I mean, it's huge. It's still standing. It's been through earthquakes and that sort of thing, but it's a big deal for Turkey and the Sultan in waiting, Recep Erdogan, who wants to revive the Ottoman Empire. And it probably frosted, this was a Byzantine Greek Orthodox church. It was eventually converted into a mosque, but about 100 years ago, when Ataturk came to power and tried to make Turkey into a secular country, he turned it into a museum, and it remains a museum to this day, although Erdogan and his fellow Islamists and Muslim Brotherhood people in the Turkish government are trying to get it away. Now, back on May 27th, the communications director of Turkey put out this is an aerial shot of the Hagia Sophia. If you look the other way, there's a huge mosque called the Blue Mosque at the other end of this plaza park area in Istanbul. This would be on the European side of the Bosphorus. You can see the other parts of Istanbul on the Asian side of the Bosphorus in the background. He said this: "We miss but less patience. We will succeed together." And as I was looking through his Twitter feed, there were a number of other things that were in the Twitter feed that, see how they're using the imagery of this Hagia Sophia? They want to turn it into a mosque. And that's what they're trying to do. I mean, it's a phenomenally beautiful, it's just shocking to me that they could build this 1,500 years ago. Especially someone I've been on the New York City subway many times. And I don't think we improved our construction abilities over time, or maintenance abilities. So what happened this was going back about 3 weeks. So on May 29th, there was a celebration in Istanbul. And here is President Erdogan. They had a flotilla of ships. And what it was the 567th anniversary of the conquest of taking back this Istanbul by Islam. They finally got rid of the Byzantine Empire. Happened on May 29th, 1453. They finally retook Istanbul. And so what they did was they had this massive celebration. This is a clip from some of the TV things. This is talking about the general who came in and took back this. This was, I was able to download this from Turkish television. And they have this, it's very well done. But this is a big deal. So when they were playing this, they were having people speak, they were having messages. Erdogan himself spoke. You'll see that in a moment. And it tells the story, these videos and that type of thing, it tells the story of what happened 567 years ago. And what they did was they did like a laser show projecting this on the outside of the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. Very similar to what we saw that was done when we were in Jerusalem in 2017. They projected these videos and things on the walls of the old city of Jerusalem. Really quite stunning. But the other thing that they did was they had Islamic prayers at the mosque. Well, excuse me, at the church, at the museum. Now, between the time that Ataturk turned it into a museum in the 1920s and 2015, a period of over 90 years, there were no Islamic prayers offered at the Hagia Sophia. The first time they were offered was in 2015, and you might remember the images of Pope Francis, who went to Istanbul a few years back and was bowing in this building while they were praying. Let me fast forward it here. Here's Erdogan. He started to speak. Here's this, what he started off with in his speech.
Rahman Rahim.
In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful. So this guy is an Islamist. And this building is a big deal to him. Turning it back into a mosque is a big deal. Now, he hasn't succeeded yet. He gave a long speech where he talked about Sultan Mehmed Han, who came and took back Istanbul 567 years ago. And in the inset there, you can kind of see some of these is a video being projected on the walls of the Hagia Sophia. Pretty good technology, by the way. You see how they do this is all projected on the building. How he blew up and took back Istanbul. So there is, now what's happened is there's been some pushback. These are the editorial cartoon from The Economist 10 or 11 years ago, about what Erdogan is about. So nobody knows, he says, I've come in peace, but he's really coming to, in peace, make it into pieces. So they came out, this was earlier, a couple days ago, the Hagia Sophia, the treasure of Sultan Mehmed, the conqueror, talking about that, and Erdogan, there's push on this. This is a Greek paper. There's a lot of tension over this now between the Greeks, Greek Orthodox, which it was a Greek Orthodox church, Turks pushing for Hagia Sophia as a mosque, and there's a lot of tension. And so some people think that Greece and Turkey may even go to war over this. Again, it's just another one of these wars and rumors of wars. But he wants to restore this. A great article in the Daily Beast by Seth Frantzman, who's an op-ed editor at the Jerusalem Post. Turkey is now the most dangerous player in the Middle East. He says this, I'll read a paragraph or two. Turkey carried out widespread airstrikes in northern Iraq on Monday, concentrating on areas inhabited by the Yazidi minority who are still trying to recover from the genocide perpetrated by ISIS. While Ankara claims it is bombing terrorists, the areas on Sinjar Mountain that were struck appear to be caves and small structures, and Turkey has provided no evidence linking these Yazidis to threats to Turkey. And by the way, Seth wrote a great book on the Islamic State, and I can't remember the title. If you just look up Seth Frantzman on Amazon, you can get it. I would highly recommend the book. It's Well, I think I told Seth this. It's like a walk through the apocalypse, reading about what the Islamic State did. So there's just a number of series. And so what you see right now is you see Turkey getting involved everywhere. They're involved in Libya. They're involved in Syria. And now news reports are that they are involved in Yemen. And all of this is part of Erdogan's plan to restore the Ottoman Empire. That's his goal. He wants to be the Sultan. But you also, if you read some of what Erdogan writes and his view, he has a very long-term view of things. And he's, well, if I'm an old man, he's almost an old man because he's actually 2 days younger than I am. But he I don't think he really cares necessarily if he accomplishes it. He wants it to be accomplished by Turkey and the restoration of the Turkish Islamic Ottoman Empire. That's very important to him. When he was a young man, he would take a ferry. His family came from around the Black Sea in central Turkey, actually the area of ancient Assyria. The northern part of the Assyrian Empire was where his family was from. He was born in Istanbul. He was the mayor of Istanbul. And now he is trying to restore the Ottoman Empire. But when he was a young man and taking ferries back and forth to Quran school in Istanbul, he was well known. He received awards for reciting the Quran. He would stand on the bow of the ferries and recite the Quran as the ferries commuted back and forth across the Bosporus. He is very well steeped in this. So he's going on. He's done things like he's trying to restore, for lack of a better term, I'll call it the blue water mandate that he thinks he has. The dark blue areas in the Mediterranean he is claiming for Turkey. And now he's entered into this agreement with with Libya for the Eastern Mediterranean control, because he's trying to shut off Israeli gas, getting from the Israeli fields in the Eastern Mediterranean up through Cyprus, over to Greece, and on to Europe. He wants to control that. So he's making claims on that. Turkey really doesn't have any gas resources of its own. Interestingly enough, Egypt right now is threatening into a similar maritime agreement with Greece. So if you could just back off the picture a little bit. So Egypt would see that line that goes from Libya to Turkey? There would be a line like that, a cone like that would go from Egypt to Greece, because they're not getting along, because Erdogan is Muslim Brotherhood to the core. The leadership of Egypt is not Muslim Brotherhood. So Erdogan is involved in all of these conflicts. They've amassed a tremendous amount of Russian debt. What they've tried to do is they've tried to buy more gas from the U.S., liquefied natural gas, because of the pandemic. It's cheaper. So he's trying to do that to control that. There were talks this week supposed to be talks between Moscow and Ankara, between Russia and Turkey, over what they're going to do with Libya and Syria and how they're going to resolve that. And this, I think, is significant and plays into Bible prophecy. So that's Seth's article in the Daily Beast. He also has an article the other day in the Jerusalem Post, the pro-Iran Islamic worldview of Turkey's foreign minister. And I'm not going to try to give you this guy's name, but he had a meeting in Ankara this week with Zarif, the foreign minister of Iran. Now, a lot of people run around and they say, Iran is Shia, Turkey is Sunni, they'll never get along, they'll never cooperate. And this is the tweet from the foreign minister of Turkey saying, "My brother, foreign minister Zarif of Iran, was my first guest during the new normal. Signed a memorandum of understanding on diplomatic and consular premises, standing against unilateral sanctions on Iran. Pandemic showed as of today we need cooperation and solidarity more than ever." So they had that meeting on Monday, June 15th, last Monday. And this is what Seth notes in his articles. The foreign minister's comments pour cold water on the theory that some U.S. diplomats and commentators have put forward that see Turkey as a NATO partner that will join against America or will join with Iran against America. No, they think. I'm sorry. They think that the people in our government think that Turkey is going to join with us to work against Iran, and so this is probably not a very good thing. So what they're doing everywhere is they're trying to foment these Islamic uprisings. Erdogan was very closely tied to ISIS. His family members made a lot of money off ISIS and that type of thing. He was never helpful in the fight against ISIS. He's now, as I said, he's now involved in Yemen and fighting against Saudi Arabia. Now, the one thing I will talk about Israel is this. There's a lot of controversy in Israel right now about whether Prime Minister Netanyahu and the government should annex about 30% of Judea and Samaria, commonly called the West Bank. So there are a number of different views on this. It's a very important strategically. In the 1967 war, Jordan, which controlled that area, was able to move its tanks across the Jordan River up to the mountain ridges because Israel did not occupy any of those. Those were all Jordanian land. And so that put Israel at great risk and peril. Now, Israel had a miraculous victory in the 67 war. But now the question is, so a lot of people are talking about, we need to annex this. The settlers are upset with the Trump plan. They don't like the way that it's working out for them. For example, Efrat, which is south of Jerusalem, it's between Jerusalem and Hebron, as we commonly call it, where the Cave of the Patriarchs is, where it's the second most important holy site to Jews in the world. So Orthodox Jews live in Efrat, a settlement. But if they want to go to Hebron under the Trump plan, at least the way it's constituted right now, they'll have to drive like up to Jerusalem, get the highway, drive all the way down to Beersheba, and come back to Hebron, Beersheba. They'll have to come back to Hebron by a fairly circuitous route. And the settlers are not happy about any of this. They're not happy with the Trump plan. So there's a lot of controversy. And the question becomes, is Netanyahu going to do this? Jonathan Spire, in his article that was in the Australian yesterday, says, I don't think Netanyahu is going to do this because Netanyahu is the consummate politician and he knows there's great risk at doing this. Caroline Glick has an article saying Netanyahu has to annex. That's in Israel Hayom. You can look those up. An interesting article or view is Dor Gold, and I'll just look at this. And what he says is, listen, I don't think we need to annex anything. He works for the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. Here's a little video they did. It's only about 3 minutes long. Does the term annexation even apply?
It so happens that this year is the 100th anniversary of the San Remo Conference, where the victorious Allied powers from World War I divided the vanquished Ottoman Empire and proposed mandates for the former territories of Ottoman Asia. The territory that was to become British Mandatory Palestine was designated as a future Jewish national home, already back then. British diplomacy in 1920 set the stage for not only the emergence of the State of Israel in 1948, but for the emergence of the entire system of Arab states. The British helped both sides. This history is pertinent to the debate that has emerged about Israel retaining parts of the West Bank this year in fulfillment of the Trump plan. It is commonly referred to as annexation, and states have pointed out that they oppose the annexation of someone else's territory. The statute of the International Criminal Court, in fact, defines as one of the acts that constitutes the crime of aggression, specifically as the annexation of the territory of another state. So is it correct to label Israeli actions with respect to the West Bank annexation? Can you annex territory that has been designated as yours? Indeed, annexation resulting from aggression is unacceptable. The Turkish invasion of Cyprus was an act of aggression. The Russian invasion of Crimea was an act of aggression. Israel in the West Bank is an entirely different story. In addition to the designation of these territories as part of the Jewish national home, one must remember that the West Bank was captured by Israel in a war of self-defense back in 1967. That makes all the difference. The great British authority on international law, Sir Elihu Lauterpacht, drew a distinction between unlawful territorial change by an aggressor and lawful territorial change in response to an act of aggression. It would be more correct not to use the term annexation, but rather the application of Israeli law to parts of the West Bank. The idea that the Jewish national home applied there was in fact backed by much of the international community from San Remo onwards. Even Article 80 of the UN Charter in 1945 established that the national rights from the period of the League of Nations carried over to the newly established United Nations. In 1920, British leadership under Prime Minister Lloyd George was pivotal in protecting Jewish national rights. Today, 100 years later, British leadership should follow that example.
So that's a very good, I think, explanation of that. So to summarize this, in 1920, the League of Nations, there were agreements that were signed at San Remo that said this land belongs to the Jewish people. There was never a Palestinian state created. When the UN was formed in 1945, they said, we recognize everything that the League of Nations has done. So they adopted that. And so I guess somebody needs to go to the UN and tell them, do you guys know what you did in 1945 and what happened in 1920? Are you unfamiliar with history? And there was never a Palestinian state anyway. So how can you so Dorgold, I think, is exactly right in what he says. And then this one last article, this is from Ynet News. It's by trying to remember Ron Ben Yishai, and he is one of the most respected sort of war correspondents, journalists in Israel. He wrote a very good article. You can look it up and get a translation of it about Iran. What's Iran doing? What are they trying to do? Are they going to do something now? Are they going to do a little bit now? And a lot later, they're going to do a lot now. He said it's up in the air, but his conclusion is that he thinks that Iran is going to try to do some things to interfere in the U.S. election and maybe get somebody else elected that would be a little more sympathetic to them, that might reinstate that JCPOA agreement. But they may go ahead and try to do something now. But Iran is still very active, even though they're having tremendous financial trouble. Their society is falling apart in many respects. They're still, I think the leadership is of a mind that they have a demographic problem. They have all sorts of problems. And they don't have a lot of time left to not do anything. So if they're going to do something, I think they're going to do it. And that's why I think they're reaching out to Turkey, because the ultimate goal is to get rid of Israel. And that's prophetic in and of itself. So interesting world this week. Again, a lot of troubling things, a little bit of good news, but I didn't even talk about the economic news. It's still, the Fed guys come out and they talk about how bad it looks, and they have all the money in the world that they're just printing, and they're concerned about it. It could be a very rough end of summer and fall in terms of conflicts and unrest and that type of thing. But listen, we know that Jesus eventually will return, and we'll be with him. He'll clean up this mess. And listen, the AI guys spent all this time and money saying, hey, boy, you know, we can make it so you can have like a heavenly existence. Well, we know that Jesus promises that. however we depart this life, we're with him, right? And that's really our goal. So let's pray. Father, thank you for your word. We pray that you will bless us this week, give us opportunities to share the hope that we have as believers that eventually Jesus will return and make things right in this world. And that our hope is always that however we depart this life, we will be with him. Bless us this week. In Jesus' name, amen.